The train shook slightly as it moved through the countryside, the windows rattling with every turn. It was crowded inside, every seat taken, every corner filled with tired faces. Sundar sat quietly beside his mother, Lakshmi, holding a small bag close to him. His eyes looked calm, but deep inside his thoughts were restless. He had come to spend time with his mother on this trip, wanting to be close to her after long months of endless work. Lakshmi sat beside him with gentle dignity. Her hands were thin, marked with age, but her spirit carried warmth. She looked at the passengers around them, noticing the mixture of stories written on their faces. Some were restless, some were lost in silence, and some looked hopeful despite the long journey. She whispered to her son softly, "Life is like this train, full of people, full of stories. We never know whose path will cross ours." As the hours passed, the train suddenly stopped between two stations. The lights flickered, and a voice came from the speakers announcing a delay. Passengers sighed in frustration. Children began to cry. A young woman carrying a baby looked worried as she tried to calm her child. The air inside grew heavy, and the sense of unease began to spread. Sundar watched silently. He had lived many years in America, leading teams, speaking to thousands, making decisions that shaped technology. Yet this moment felt more real than any conference stage. Here he was, simply a son, sitting beside his mother, surrounded by ordinary people who carried extraordinary struggles. The baby's cry grew louder, drawing attention. Some passengers frowned, irritated by the sound. The young mother's eyes filled with helplessness as she tried to hush her child. Lakshmi leaned slightly forward, her gentle voice breaking the tension. "Do you need some help?" she asked the young woman with genuine care. The woman looked surprised but nodded slowly. She whispered that the baby was hungry, but she had no water left to mix with the milk powder she carried. The train's delay had stretched longer than she expected, and now she was desperate. Without hesitation, Sundar stood up. He scanned the compartment and saw an old man holding a bottle of water. Sundar approached him respectfully and asked if he could share a little. The old man looked at him, then at the young mother, and nodded. Sundar carefully brought the water back, and his mother mixed it with the milk powder. She handed the bottle back to the young woman, who held it with trembling hands and fed her baby. The crying softened. A small silence filled the air, but this time it was not heavy. It was warm. People watched quietly as the scene unfolded. In that small act, the tension of the crowded train melted away. A stranger had been helped, a child had been comforted, and hearts that carried frustration now carried something lighter. Sundar sat back down beside his mother, his eyes meeting hers. She gave him a small smile, the kind that carried both pride and humility. "Son," she whispered, "this is what matters. No matter how high you rise, never forget to bend down and help someone in need." As the train continued to stay still, passengers began to share small gestures with one another. A man offered biscuits to the children nearby. A woman adjusted her seat so an older traveler could rest more comfortably. The spirit of kindness spread, not through speeches or grand gestures, but through simple acts. For Sundar, this moment touched him deeply. He thought about how the world often admired power, success, and recognition. But here, in this crowded train, none of that mattered. What mattered was humanity. The quiet strength that his mother always carried and passed on to him, and as he sat there, watching the baby now sleeping peacefully in the arms of the young woman, Sundar felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel in the middle of his busy life. He felt stillness, the kind that reminded him who he truly was beyond the titles, beyond the fame. His mother leaned back, closing her eyes gently, her hand resting on his arm. He looked at her with quiet respect, knowing that her presence was the foundation of everything he had become. And in that silent train, surrounded by strangers, he realized once again that sometimes the most powerful stories are written in the smallest gestures. The train still stood motionless on the track. The loudspeaker crackled once again, but this time there was no clear update, only static and then silence. People sighed louder, and the weight of uncertainty grew heavier inside the crowded compartment. Sundar glanced at his mother. Lakshmi's calm face was steady, though the heat and lack of fresh air were beginning to show in the tiredness of her eyes. He quietly pulled out a small cloth from his bag and fanned her gently. She smiled faintly and said, "You always try to protect me, even in the smallest ways. But remember, I am stronger than I look." Sundar nodded, though deep inside he worried. His mother was aging, and every extra minute of discomfort pressed against his heart. He wished he could somehow move the train, clear the tracks, and make this journey easier for her. But here, he was not the CEO of a global company. He was just a son, helpless in the same way as everyone else. Suddenly, from the other end of the compartment, a voice rose. It was sharp, filled with irritation. A middle-aged man was arguing loudly with a ticket inspector who had just stepped inside. The man shouted that he had urgent work and could not waste his time sitting here. He demanded answers, demanding to know why the train was stuck. The inspector tried to explain calmly, but the man's voice only grew harsher. Passengers began to turn their heads. Some supported the man, echoing his anger. Others shook their heads, tired of complaints. The tension that had softened earlier was now rising again. Lakshmi looked at Sundar and whispered softly, "Anger spreads faster than kindness, but kindness lasts longer. Let us not forget that." As the argument grew louder, a young boy sitting nearby suddenly fainted. His mother cried out in fear, shaking him desperately. Panic filled the air. People stood, crowding around, their voices overlapping in confusion. Sundar reacted instantly. He moved toward the boy, asking the mother what had happened. She said he had been unwell since morning, but insisted on traveling because she could not afford to delay their journey. Now the heat and lack of air had drained him completely. Lakshmi, though frail herself, stepped forward and knelt beside the boy. She held his small hand gently, whispering comfort as if her words carried healing. Sundar looked around and asked if anyone had medical training. Finally, a young man raised his hand and came forward, checking the boy's pulse. The man said the boy needed water and sugar immediately to regain energy. Sundar searched quickly and found a small packet of biscuits in his bag. Another passenger offered some sugar cubes, and someone else handed a bottle of clean water. Together, they prepared a simple solution and gave it to the boy. Minutes felt like hours, but slowly, the boy's eyes opened. His mother's tears streamed down her face as she whispered blessings to everyone who had helped. The boy sat weakly against her, but alive, his breathing steady once again. A deep silence fell across the train. The man who had been shouting earlier now stood quiet, his anger dissolved in the face of what had just happened. He lowered his head, perhaps ashamed that his voice had filled the air with frustration while others had filled it with care. Lakshmi looked at Sundar, her voice soft but firm. "See, son, this is what I mean. In the end, kindness does not only help the one in need. It changes everyone who witnesses it." Sundar felt his chest tighten with emotion. His mind drifted back to his own childhood when his mother would give food to neighbors, even when their own home had little. He remembered how she taught him that respect was not measured by wealth or position, but by the way one treated those who had nothing to give back. The train finally jolted slightly, moving only a few meters before stopping again. People sighed, but this time the air carried less frustration. Something had shifted inside that compartment. Strangers were no longer strangers. They had shared a moment of fear, a moment of help, and a moment of relief together. As the boy leaned against his mother, Sundar returned to his seat. He watched his mother close her eyes again, her lips moving silently in prayer. He understood in that moment that every small act they had done was not just about helping others. It was about carrying forward the values his mother had quietly lived by her entire life. And as the train remained stuck in the silence of the countryside, Sundar realized this journey was going to teach him more than any classroom, more than any boardroom, more than any award he had ever received. The train stood still, surrounded by endless fields that stretched out beyond the windows. A few cows wandered in the distance, their slow movements almost mocking the passengers trapped inside with nowhere to go. The heat inside grew heavier and the air felt thick. Some passengers fanned themselves with newspapers while others leaned back trying to rest, though unease sat quietly in every heart. Sundar looked out the window, then back at his mother. Lakshmi remained calm, her face glowing with quiet strength even in the discomfort. Sundar leaned closer and whispered, "Are you all right, Amma?" She nodded gently, her hand resting on his arm. "I am fine, son. I have seen far harder days. Patience is our best friend right now." Her words carried him back to his childhood. He remembered days when his family would wait in long queues for food, days when electricity would cut out, and nights when they would sit together under the dim glow of a single lamp. His mother never complained. Instead, she would tell stories to keep their minds away from the struggles. And here she was again, unchanged, teaching him patience in silence. Suddenly, from the other side of the compartment, a commotion began. A group of young men, restless and frustrated, started shouting that they would break open the doors and leave the train. Fear spread among some passengers as the idea of being stranded in the middle of nowhere unsettled them. One of the young men pushed against the door, rattling it hard. His friend shouted, "Why should we sit here like fools? Who knows how long this train will be stuck? Let's find our own way." The inspector tried to calm them, saying it was dangerous to step outside in the middle of the tracks. But his voice was drowned in their anger. Lakshmi opened her eyes slowly and whispered to Sundar, "Go and speak to them, not with force but with respect. Sometimes people listen more when they are treated with dignity." Sundar stood, his heart racing. He was not used to speaking in such settings. In boardrooms, his words carried weight. Here he was just another passenger. Still, he remembered his mother's teaching. He walked toward the young men. He spoke in a calm tone. "Brothers, I understand you are frustrated. We all are. But if you leave now, you might hurt yourself. The tracks are not safe, and you don't know how far the next station is. What if something happens on the way? Please think again." The men looked at him with irritation. One of them sneered. "And who are you to tell us what to do? You think your words will change anything?" For a moment, Sundar felt small. But then he remembered how his mother always taught him that respect is not about convincing with power, but with sincerity. He said softly, "I am no one special. I am just like you, sitting here in the same heat, waiting for the same train to move. But I believe if we stay together, we will be safer. If we separate, we will only make things worse." His words carried a certain weight, not because of who he was, but because of the truth in them. The men grew quiet, their anger slowly fading. One of them finally sighed and said, "Fine. We'll wait a little longer, but if this continues, we are not staying." Sundar nodded and thanked them sincerely. He returned to his seat, his mother's eyes watching him with pride. She whispered, "You did not argue. You respected their anger, and that is why they listened." Time moved slowly, the train still unmoving. Children dozed off in their mothers' laps, while elders sat with weary patience. Sundar reached into his bag again and shared a few fruits he had carried for his mother with nearby passengers. Soon others followed, passing food, sharing water, and offering small comforts to each other. In that crowded compartment, something rare was happening. Strangers were beginning to feel like a community, bound not by choice but by shared struggle. But just when the mood seemed to settle, another twist arrived. The loudspeaker crackled again, and the announcement revealed that the train might be delayed for several more hours due to a serious issue on the track ahead. A wave of frustration rolled through the compartment. Some groaned, some cursed softly under their breath, and others fell into silence. Lakshmi closed her eyes again, whispering prayers only she could hear. Sundar looked around, sensing the rising storm inside people's hearts. He knew this delay was no longer about the train. It was about patience, about kindness, about how people chose to treat one another in times of hardship. And as he sat back, holding his mother's fragile hand, he did not realize that the coming hours would test not only the passengers, but his own spirit in ways he had never faced before. The hours stretched on, and the train remained still. The silence outside felt almost endless, broken only by the distant sound of birds and the occasional creak of metal as the train shifted under its own weight. Inside the compartment, the air had grown thick, and passengers grew restless again. Though some had begun to bond through small acts of kindness, patience was beginning to fade. Sundar looked at his mother. Lakshmi's face showed quiet strength, but Sundar noticed the way her breathing grew slower. She tried to hide her tiredness, but he could see it. He gently held her hand and whispered, "Amma, you should rest." She smiled faintly and said, "Rest will come when it must. For now I want to watch, to listen, to see how people reveal themselves in these hours." Her words lingered with him. He realized she was not just enduring this delay, she was observing it as a lesson in humanity. Suddenly, a new sound broke the stillness. It was the voice of a man coughing harshly. People turned their heads and saw an older traveler struggling for breath. His daughter fanned him desperately, her eyes filled with fear. She cried out, "Is there anyone who can help?" The compartment fell into uneasy silence. Some people looked away, unsure what to do. Others hesitated, afraid of making things worse. Sundar stood up immediately and moved toward them. He asked the daughter gently, "Does he have any medicine?" She shook her head. "We were supposed to get it at the next station, but now we are stuck." Her voice cracked, trembling with helplessness. Lakshmi slowly rose from her seat. Her steps were small but steady. She reached into her small cloth bag and pulled out a packet of herbal medicine she always carried. She handed it to the daughter and said softly, "This may help. Crush it in water and give it to him. It will not cure everything, but it will ease his breath." The daughter's hands shook as she followed her instructions. Minutes later, the old man's breathing began to calm. Relief spread across his face and tears filled the daughter's eyes. She held Lakshmi's hands tightly and whispered, "Thank you, Amma. May God bless you." The passengers who had hesitated earlier now looked at Lakshmi with quiet respect. They saw her not as a fragile old woman, but as a source of strength, the kind of strength that comes not from wealth or power, but from love and experience. Sundar watched his mother and felt a surge of pride mixed with humility. He thought about how people often praised him for his leadership, yet it was her simple wisdom that guided him. Without her, he would not be the man he was today. Just as the mood softened again, the loudspeaker finally returned. The voice of the conductor explained that there had been an accident on the tracks ahead. A cargo train had derailed and the line would take hours to clear. Gasps filled the compartment. Some passengers groaned loudly, their frustration boiling over. "Hours more? How can we sit here like this?" one man shouted. Another passenger, a young woman traveling alone, spoke softly but firmly. "Complaining will not move the train. Maybe we should think about how to get through this together." Her words cut through the noise, reminding everyone that unity was the only choice they had. Sundar looked at his mother. Lakshmi nodded slightly, as if encouraging him to step forward again. He stood and addressed the passengers, his voice calm but steady. "Friends, we cannot change what has happened outside, but we can decide what happens inside this train. We can fight or we can help one another. I believe kindness will carry us further than anger." His words touched something in the room. People grew quiet, reflecting. Even the ones who had been shouting moments earlier lowered their voices. Then, something unexpected happened. A small boy stood up with a notebook in his hand. He said shyly, "Can we play a game? Everyone can tell a story and I will write it down." His innocence brought a ripple of laughter through the compartment. Lakshmi's eyes sparkled with warmth as she whispered to Sundar, "See, even a child can remind us that light is always present, even in darkness." Soon passengers began sharing small stories, memories of their homes, tales from their villages, and even jokes to make children smile. The atmosphere, though heavy with delay, began to carry a quiet warmth again. Strangers were becoming companions in this shared test of patience. But as night slowly began to fall outside and darkness touched the fields, Sundar felt a deep sense of unease. Something about the silence beyond the windows felt different, heavier, almost like a shadow waiting to reveal itself. Night fell across the countryside, wrapping the train in a heavy blanket of silence. The fields outside, once alive with daylight, now looked endless and dark. The only glow came from the dim bulbs inside the train, flickering now and then as though even they were tired of waiting. The compartment was quiet at first, but not peaceful. Quiet in the way people grow when fear begins to settle. Children clung to their parents. Elders leaned back, whispering prayers. Some passengers tried to sleep, but the discomfort of the crowded space and the uncertainty of the night made rest difficult. Sundar sat close to his mother, watching her face in the faint light. Lakshmi's eyes remained steady, though her body showed signs of fatigue. He whispered, "Amma, do you want me to ask if someone can bring fresh air from the next compartment?" She shook her head gently. "No, son, I am fine. But keep your eyes open. Nights test people in ways days cannot." Those words proved true quickly. At the far end of the compartment, a group of restless men began whispering among themselves. Their voices were low but carried a sharpness that disturbed the silence. One of them muttered, "Everyone is distracted, tired, and weak. This is the right time." Sundar's ears caught the words, and a chill ran through him. Soon the men stood up. One of them moved toward a young woman traveling alone. She had spoken bravely earlier in the day, but now she sat nervously clutching her bag. The man smirked, saying, "Sister, it is not safe to keep valuables with you in such a place. Better you hand it over for protection." The woman froze, her eyes wide. Whispers spread across the compartment. Fear rose quickly. Sundar felt his heart pound. He wanted to stand up immediately, but Lakshmi's hand touched his arm. She looked into his eyes, her voice low but firm. "Remember, strength without respect only creates more fear. If you stand, stand with calm. Not as a fighter, but as someone who restores balance." He took a breath and rose. The men looked at him with sharp eyes. One of them sneered, "And who are you to stop us?" Sundar's voice was calm, steady. "I am no one important. Just another passenger like you. But I cannot stay silent when someone is threatened. If you need help, we can find a way together. But if you take from others in their weakness, you will only break yourself." His words were not shouted. They were soft, almost like his mother's. And yet they carried weight. The men laughed at first, but their laughter was uneasy. They were not expecting calm words. They were expecting fear, anger, or silence. Sundar looked around, and for the first time, other passengers began to rise too. The young boy with the notebook stood up bravely and said, "Leave her alone." Another elder added, "Enough of this. We are all stuck here together. We must respect each other." Slowly, the balance shifted. The men, seeing the unity, muttered angrily but stepped back. One of them spat on the floor and said, "Fine, we are not interested anymore." They sat down, grumbling to themselves, but the danger had passed. The young woman's eyes filled with tears. She whispered to Sundar, "Thank you." Sundar simply nodded and returned to his seat. Lakshmi looked at him with quiet pride. "You did well, son. You faced darkness not with fire but with light." The train compartment exhaled together, relief spreading. People who had once been strangers now leaned closer to one another. They realized that survival in the night depended not on selfishness, but on unity. Hours dragged on. The darkness outside felt endless. But inside, something began to grow stronger. Passengers shared food, shared blankets, and shared stories to pass the night. Laughter returned in small sparks. Children smiled again, and even those who had been restless began to soften. Yet as dawn approached, the conductor walked through the compartments with grim news. He explained that clearing the tracks might take longer than expected, perhaps even a full day more. A wave of despair rolled through the passengers, but Sundar turned to his mother. She looked tired, but her voice carried the same quiet strength. "Son, this is what life often gives us, moments we cannot change. What we do in those moments is what defines us." Sundar held her hand tightly, realizing that this night, filled with fear and uncertainty, had already changed him. The first light of dawn entered the train, faint and soft, painting the fields outside with a pale glow. The night had been long, heavy, and unforgettable. The passengers were weary, but the new day brought a small sense of relief. Children stretched in their mothers' laps, elders rubbed their eyes, and some passengers whispered prayers of gratitude for surviving the restless night. Sundar sat quietly beside his mother. Lakshmi leaned against the seat, her eyes closed, her face pale but peaceful. Sundar watched her carefully. He noticed how her breathing was slower than before, how her hands trembled slightly when she tried to adjust her shawl. His heart tightened with worry. He whispered gently, "Amma, are you all right?" She opened her eyes slowly and gave a faint smile. "I am fine, son. Do not worry for me. I have lived long years. My only wish is to see you always remember the value of kindness, no matter where life takes you." Her words pierced deep into Sundar's heart. He held her fragile hand tightly, feeling the weight of her years, her sacrifices, and her wisdom. Before he could respond, a cry echoed from the far end of the compartment. A man stumbled into the aisle, clutching his chest. His wife screamed, "He cannot breathe!" Panic spread instantly. Passengers jumped to their feet, some moving back in fear, others rushing to help. Sundar stood up at once. He moved toward the man who had collapsed onto the floor. The wife begged desperately, "Please, is there a doctor here?" A young medical student stepped forward nervously. "I am not a full doctor yet, but I can try." He knelt beside the man, checking his pulse. His hands trembled, but he kept calm. He whispered, "We need to keep him awake. He might not survive until we reach a hospital." The compartment grew silent, every pair of eyes watching in fear. Sundar knelt beside the student and asked, "What do you need? Water? Something sweet? Anything to give him energy," the student said quickly. Passengers scrambled. Someone brought a half-empty bottle of water, another offered a piece of jaggery, and another tore a cloth to use as support for the man's head. The student mixed the jaggery with water and carefully gave it to the man. Minutes dragged by, heavy and painful, until the man finally coughed weakly and opened his eyes. His wife broke into tears, holding his hand tightly. Whispers of relief spread through the compartment, and some passengers clapped softly, not for celebration, but for survival. Lakshmi had moved closer during the commotion. She placed her hand gently on the man's forehead, whispering blessings. Sundar saw how even in her own weakness, she carried the strength to comfort others. But when they returned to their seat, Sundar noticed his mother's body shaking slightly. He whispered, "Amma, you need to rest." She closed her eyes, her voice soft. "Son, when we give, life always takes something from us. But what it gives back is greater." Her words unsettled him. He felt fear pressing against his chest. He could not imagine this journey without her. As the morning stretched on, passengers began sharing food together. Someone passed around fresh fruits, another offered bread, and strangers became like family. The young boy with the notebook, who had started writing stories the previous day, now read aloud what he had written, small lines about courage, kindness, and patience. People smiled, some even wiping away tears. Sundar listened, but his eyes stayed on his mother. He thought about her life, the sacrifices she had made, the nights she had gone hungry to feed him, the times she had walked long distances so her children could study. And now, here she was, still giving, still teaching, even when her own strength was fading. The announcement finally came in the afternoon. The tracks had been cleared. The train would move soon. Cheers filled the compartment, voices rising with relief. People smiled, hugged, and clapped, their spirits lifted after endless hours of waiting. But Sundar noticed his mother did not smile. She leaned her head gently against the seat, her eyes closed, her lips moving silently as if in prayer. He held her hand, whispering, "Amma, we are moving now. We will reach soon." She opened her eyes slowly, her gaze soft but deep. "Yes, son," she whispered. "But remember, the journey of life is never about how quickly we reach the end. It is about how we walk with others on the way." The train shuddered, the wheels groaning as it finally began to move forward. Cheers echoed again, but Sundar's heart remained heavy. He felt a strange fear inside, as though this journey was not only about reaching the next station, it was about something far greater, something life-changing. He tightened his grip on his mother's hand, silently praying that she would stay with him through whatever came next.